So you got to split into like diehard fans and like casual fans. And this is no judgment, because there's no glory in being a diehard fan, particularly. But the diehard fan totally understands where the Raptors are after Kawhi left and more of those veterans eventually walked away from the team. They try to make a go with it with some of the other guys, Pascal, Siakam, Fred VanVleet, OG Anunoby, et cetera, et cetera. Try to make a go with Nick Nurse. They just kind of ran into a situation where it didn't really fit the best, and it wasn't the happiest locker room.
They are the host of the Hello and Welcome podcast, which covers the Toronto Raptors. We have the pleasure in welcoming Lou and Alex Wong onto Hoopsology. Welcome.
What's going on, man? Thanks for having us.
What's up, guys? Thanks for having us.
Thanks for coming on to the show. Really appreciate it. Our show covers the NBA and WNBA, all the latest news, but we celebrate basketball culture, what makes the game of basketball great compared to other sports. So before we hop into the Raptors talk, I want to ask both of you, take this question any way you want it. What is your first or favorite basketball memory?
Yeah, Will, go ahead.
I mean, favorite basketball memory? It's probably got to be 2019 when the Raptors won the championship. I think what was really cool about it was seeing the entire nation of Canada get together and watch basketball for the first time en masse. The Raptors, for example, each time they go to the playoffs, right outside of Scotiabank Arena, they'll set up something called Jurassic Park, where obviously people got to pay to go inside the building, but there's a gigantic, huge screen outside the building, and they close the street and they have just people pack in and just fans sort of just watching on the screens. And that's been a thing ever since the Raptors got back to the playoffs in 2014. But in 2019, it wasn't just a Toronto phenomenon. It became like people were gathering everywhere across Canada to watch it. I think by the time Game 6, when the Raptors beat Golden State to win the chip, there was 280 Jurassic Parks set up across the country. And I just think that that sense of community, that sense of connectivity, that sense of wonder, really only sports can really do that for you. And I think it was really cool to see that happen in basketball, because it never actually even happened like that for hockey. It couldn't even happen like that for hockey. If the Toronto Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup at the end of this summer, there would not be celebrations across the country, I guarantee you, because there's obviously different teams and people are quite tribal about it. But seeing that all come together for the Raptors in 2019 was awesome.
Yeah, I think for me personally, man, I kind of go back to even just when I was in ninth grade, being on a basketball team for a first time, even just discovering basketball, meeting friends growing up, just playing basketball, during recess, in the playground and being on the team, as someone who immigrated from, Hong Kong to here to Toronto when I was a young kid. Early on, it was hard sometimes to kind of fit in and find the right group or find people with similar interests. And I would say joining a basketball team was one of the first times it really kind of opened up those experiences. And it's cool to hear Will and a lot of other people talk about 2019 championship. What was celebrated a lot too was, you hear outsiders talk about Toronto, about just diversity of the fan base and all that stuff. And I think a lot of us here growing up really experienced that firsthand just by the different communities that we get involved in, from a basketball standpoint.
So jumping into Will's point, now the Raptors, they're in a bit of a rebuilding mode. What is the temperature of the Raptors fan base since then? A lot's gone down from the pandemic to now in terms of a new coach, Scotty Barnes. What's kind of the feeling of the fans? Are they impatient? Are they the clock's ticking here, what's going on with this? Or are they be impatient in terms of kind of buy into the vision?
So you got to split into diehard fans and casual fans. And this is no judgment, because there's no glory in being a diehard fan, particularly. But the diehard fan totally understands where the Raptors are after Kawhi left and more of those veterans eventually walked away from the team. They try to make a go with it with some of the other guys, Pascal, Siakam, Fred VanVleet, OG Anunoby, et cetera, et cetera. Trying to make a go with Nick Nurse. They just kind of ran into a situation where it didn't really fit the best, and it wasn't the happiest locker room, and ultimately they just weren't even talented enough to come close to sort of what they were trying to repeat. So they needed to sort of reset. A lot of those guys were going to get pretty expensive. When you look around the league now, OG's making 40, Fred's making 40, Pascal's making 40. So you weren't going to sort of sign all three of those guys. And so the Raptors need to pivot towards a rebuild. So like every diehard fan understands that like Raptors are going through that rebuild right now. Part of that process is sort of like winning a game a month, basically, which is kind of like the stretch that they're on. And hopefully in the long term, you get some more pieces around. You wait like 3-4 years, like they're kind of back at it, maybe with something more sustainable. Um, I think the casual fan, I run into a lot of casual fans, especially because like the good thing about winning a championship is like it expands like the audience and the reach that you get. And so even though they might not be like listening to every episode and like tapping into every Raptor game, they'll see me. They'll be like, "Oh, you're the Raptors guy. Like, what's going on? Like, what's going on with the team?" And like, I don't have much good to tell them. I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, Alex sees this interaction all the time, and I'm just kind of like, yeah, we're just kind of down bad for a little bit, but just check back in like a year or two.
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of we do like live post game shows for our Hello and Welcome podcast, and then part of that is fans being able to tap in and give their feedback in real time, like in chats, and you can imagine, the team is what 9-31 right now, I think, as we're recording, and a lot of those fans are really frustrated. I think, I like to say that like Raptors fan base is probably one of the most impatient fan bases, and maybe that does come from like having recently won a championship. Although more and more as I like zoom out and look at other fan bases too, I feel like that's just basketball fans in general. Like no one's really happy with their teams unless you're like an OKC or like a Boston. Like people just always want the teams to kind of get back to where they are. But yeah, to answer your question right now, like I think it's just really frustrating for a lot of fans to kind of deal with a season like this, even though they know the goal is to get into the draft lottery, is to continue rebuilding. It's not fun watching a team go through. They went through a stretch recently where I think they have 4 straight games where they trailed by 30 plus points. Like it's just, regardless of what the long term goals are, like it's just not fun watching that night in, night out.
No, that makes sense. I want to follow up on, you brought up Nick Nurse, and I'm curious your thoughts on him as Raptors fans. Obviously he makes the move to Philadelphia. They're also having, I think, some more unexpected struggles when you look at what people were projecting at the start of this season. Does it surprise you to see even still what went on with Philadelphia? And how much blame do you maybe assign to Nick Nurse from that outside looking in perspective?
It's it's hard to just like pin it all on Nick in Philadelphia, because I think the elephant in the room is clearly Joel Embiid, and he's kind of like an energy suck. I feel like in a lot of times, like it feels like he just doesn't look particularly happy a lot of the time. He's in and out of the lineup. Seems like he kind of decides when he wants to play, when he doesn't want to play. Of course, that comes down to his body breaking down. So I'm not saying that this is just on a whim, but it's hard to sort of run your franchise like that. They've also had like a comical stretch of injuries. So that's gonna be hard for anyone to manage. At the same time, I do feel like with Nick, like he's certainly not the type of coach that's gonna like handhold everybody and sort of like make it a sort of an overly cheery atmosphere. I do feel like he's pretty hard on his players. He's pretty frank when he comes to talking about what needs to be addressed. He does have this. I remember 2019 when he took over from assistant to head coach. He was very proud of saying that year that he had like a toy elephant in his coach's office, and he'd be like, if the players ever need to talk to me, they could just come in, take that toy elephant and put it on the table. Which I know sounds a little bit silly, but I think the root of it is that he wants to sort of like get at sort of the problems like straightforwardly. And yeah, obviously that can lead to some tension and people are unhappy. But I do feel like it's the other part with Nick is just he does love to play veterans, and he really, really likes to play them a lot of minutes. I think it's a little bit similar to a Tom Thibodeau style when it comes to sort of like really trying to wring out every result, especially even in the regular season. And I could see that, like, especially with a team that doesn't have a lot of depth in particular in Philadelphia right now, that like, that could affect things. But I mean, I would say he probably is in the top 3, but he's not the top 1 in terms of the problem.
Yeah, and like that strategy of like playing 6-7 guys, like, it works. It works for the Knicks because like, the guys mostly have been healthy and it's like a really good starting 5. It worked here in Toronto too for a time because like during those years they had great players. But you look at the Sixers, like Embiid's always in and out of the lineup. I think Paul George has been pretty disappointing. Maxi's had a pretty disappointing season. And I think I'm with Will. It kind of just goes back to Embiid. Like he was called out earlier this year in a team meeting for just not setting a good example, for being late. What's up with the punctuality problem in the NBA, by the way? We got Jimmy Butler, punctuality problems. Zion Williamson, perpetual punctuality problems. You know, we got to go back and start taking attendance and stuff, man. All these superstars are just showing up late now. And they're getting fined for it. So, but yeah, it's all Embiid's fault.
That's interesting you bring that up, because I think that might tie into the effort issue that we're seeing with a lot of the players and a lot of the unsatisfaction we're seeing from fans, and what's contributing to just the low ratings and just unhappiness with the NBA All-Star game. Is it kind of like, I don't want to sound like, I'm a old person or something, but is it kind of like this era of players are, I hate saying this, but more entitled? Like you mentioned that, Alex. I'm just thinking, is there like an entitlement problem with these players in this generation, or do you think these are just anomaly situations, or do you think there's more something insidious going on here with the kind of this era of players?
I mean, I don't even blame it on the players. I feel like this is just kind of the era that they are playing in right now. And like, these players have, NBA players have never been as big stars as they are now, arguably, just because of like the global reach, because of their own social media platforms, because of all these player podcasts that like Will and I always complain about. But it's like there's just so much exposure now. Like, you do wonder who are the players who are actually really motivated, right? Like, I feel like more than ever in this era, we have questions about like, does Ben Simmons want to play basketball? Does Zion want to be serious about being a superstar? And some of that stuff used to just not be things that you would question. You would worry about superstars because of injuries, because of bad breaks and stuff. But the expectation was you were drafted to a team, you had a certain level of talent, and these guys really did want to be the best player and compete for these championships. And I feel like we are seeing more and more that being like less of a thing with some of these players, which I don't know if it's a good or bad thing. I just think this is just the era that they live in.
Yeah, I mean, plus the contract sizes are so big, right? Like, at a certain point, like, you make it that first max contract, like, you're set for life. Your entire family is set for multiple generations if you do it right. And like, at that point, it becomes less about the money and more about like, what is your personal stake? How competitive are you? How much do you want to achieve within the game? That's something where when you look at a guy like Wemby, and obviously Wemby is super young, but one of the things that really stands out with Wemby is just like, even in his rookie season when, he didn't start the rookie season like the absolute best, like I think the second half of the season, Wemby really turned it on. But it felt like all those first matchups where he played against KD, he played against Giannis, he was just trying to go at these guys. And I love that about him. Like that, there's like, obviously you got paid the same whether you have 40 points or 4 points, right? But like, he really, really wanted to step up to that challenge. You could tell he relished that idea and that example. And who knows, maybe in 5 years, when he gets that supermax contract, which you obviously will deserve, and he grows up a little bit and there's more things in his life to worry about, maybe he's not as like, he doesn't get the same joy from it every single day. But I hope he does. And I do think they're very, very special ones, like a Kobe, like LeBron's. Like, these guys are like competitive right from the very get-go, and they just never lose sight of like, yes, they get paid for this, but the most important thing is how hard they compete and how much they want to be the best and be crowned as the best.
A quick timeout from the interview to request a favor. If you love our interviews, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video to hear more interviews from the world of basketball, featuring journalists from SB Nation, ESPN, CBS Sports, and The Athletic. Now, back to the interview.
Well said. I want to zoom out from that point that Justin brought up and ask you guys your thoughts, because this whole the NBA sky is falling kind of narrative. You guys have seen it, I'm sure. It's everywhere. It's been with us all season long, maybe even coming into the season. We know financially right now at the moment, I mean, the NBA is in the best spot it's ever been in terms of TV contracts, things like that. But when you look at the game as fans, I mean, do you agree with any part of that narrative that there are problems in the NBA that need to be fixed, or do you feel otherwise about it?
I mean, I think that like there's certainly some games that make you look a little sideways. Like, I used to get really excited to see a game that was like it finished 130 to 125, and it usually involved like, I don't know, the Phoenix Suns back in the day, and they were like playing at such a high pace and defensively, whatever. But it excited me because I was like, holy, how did the team score 130 points in 48 minutes? Like, let me go see that. And then I don't know, you get games like Atlanta last year played like multiple like 150 plus point games in regulation. Some of them they lost. Like, imagine scoring 150 and you lost. Like, it starts to make it feel a little bit less like meaningful. Um, I mean, there's like the 3-point complaints as well. I think that's probably just up to personal preference, but I still do think that like as long as the marquee matchups are good, I think that's probably the most important thing. Like, I think it was a huge win for the league when Cleveland went up head to head with OKC, and both of them were on 10 plus game winning streaks, and it came right down to the wire. ESPN flexed it, into their schedule, and it really delivered. And everybody was happy, from like the casual fan to like the nerd about basketball who was like, I told you, like, Evan Mobley is like great. Look at this layup he took over, Isaiah Hartenstein. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's kind of cool. Like, those kind of matchups are obviously always going to be important for the league, but yeah, I mean, maybe you like your average game, and especially this season, there's a lot of tanking teams as well. Like, obviously, we're covering one in the Raptors, but like, there's like 6 or 7 teams that I would say are probably going to be pivoting hard into a tank in the second half of the year, which is just not good. It almost feels like there's 2 leagues happening at once.
Yeah, my issue is just with kind of the length of the regular season. I think just across the board with sports, outside of the NFL, like I feel like the regular season has just been really diminished in terms of being able to like hold the interest of the casual viewer. And I think it's almost as simple as just the amount of time commitment that's required to follow not just one team, or if you want to follow the NBA through an 82 game schedule. And there, like Will mentioned, there's maybe like how many teams are tanking, which leaves you how many teams are still interesting. And then depending on the certain nights, guys might not be available, and you only have so many marquee matchups. And then the other thing too is like the league's kind of in a weird spot where like some of the biggest stars that they're still pushing are like in the twilight of their career. You got Braun, Steph, and KD, which still really fun players to watch, but not necessarily on the most watchable teams or exciting teams. So I think they could benefit from just like more Wemby, more Shea, like just really pushing some of these more younger and up and coming teams that fans can watch more of.
So I want to shift to the Raptors and with the rebuild. What are your impressions of Darko Rajakovic, Scotty Barnes? Where do you see kind of this rebuild going into the future in terms of the draft, how this season's laid out? Are you happy in terms of where you're projecting for the Raptors 5, 6 years from now, or do you see some red flags that might be of concern?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now is a pretty critical evaluation period for the Raptors because like they do have this is obviously a month before the trade deadline. They are actually playing their veterans. And relatively speaking, the team's pretty healthy. Emmanuel quickly keeps coming in and on the lineup, but I think this one is like a pretty much like a day-to-day thing he's got with his hip. So it is a pretty important period to evaluate what does the actual team on paper right now show, and do they play together? I feel like if they don't play well together this month, or maybe even the rest of the calendar year until the end of the season, like then you probably have to look at a longer term rebuild. I think maybe if you start to see like, okay, RJ this year had some really, really good games. Like for a while, he was averaging 30 plus at home, which is kind of ridiculous. And he was doing it efficiently too. Defensively, obviously, he's a minus, but 30 is still 30. IQ, I thought he finished last season pretty strong. Certainly there was questions of like, can he sort of extend from being a 6-man type to being a starter? Or can he also sort of be a lead guard for a team rather than sort of like an off guard? I think he kind of answered both of those questions last year, and that's why he got a big contract this summer. And then I think the most important thing is just with Scotty, like, is he kind of like a number 2 going forward? Is he more of a number 1? And he does have a lot of really great secondary skills, which I think, will probably lend better to him being a number 2 in terms of he's a really good passer. He's a really strong rebounder. He pretty much defends like every position, pretty well. He could certainly switch a lot too. But I think the one question is like, okay, what is his scoring package look like? Can he be an efficient scorer? Can he be a volume scorer? Does he have sort of go-to moves? This year, they're kind of just trying him out. So like 1 month, you'll be like, okay, I'll take 10 threes. The next month, it's like, okay, I'm not going to take threes, but I'm going to take a bunch of mid-range. And then the next month, I'm not sure what he's going to do, right? So like that's kind of how the season's gone for him. So it's kind of like a weird trial this year more than anything else. Of course, like the best scenario is that the Raptors are both able to show that their core three can play well together and that there's something there while also getting a top pick out of this year. But right now, I think the early returns are just kind of like, it's not necessarily working out all that great together. It doesn't really matter which five you put on the floor. The Raptors kind of still lose. Again, they're 9-31. But I think it's better to ask me at the end of the year. Right now, they just had a lot of injuries, and a lot of the stuff is TBD.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of frustrations recently, conversations around whether, Darko is the right coach for this team. And it's like, that's the tough part of a rebuilding team too. It's like so hard to evaluate, right? Like, what is the point of bringing in another coach? But at the same time, it's like there has to be some accountability. Like I mentioned, like their defense was just falling off a cliff and giving up like 140, 150 every game, especially when there was emphasis coming into the season that they were going to at least try to improve like a little bit, on that end. And none of that has happened. So I think to your question, like it's just really hard to evaluate a lot of these things, like when it comes to Darko and with Scotty too, right? Like it's hard because like he's not like a Luka type where like, you put him in any situation, he'd be putting up these monster numbers. Seen his offensive game grow. You can see that he has an all-around game, but what does that look like with better rosters? Like, is he able to kind of lift teams in like a winning environment? You're not going to be able to get answers to that until you start making your roster better. So, yeah, they really need to hit on this upcoming draft. Like if they don't get the right player or that player that kind of fits with this lottery pick that they're banking on, then I think it's gonna be tough to kind of map out the future for this team.
And you guys, if I could ask you to look into your crystal ball, so to speak, do you see the Raptors being kind of facilitators in the trade deadline? Do you see them kind of holding suit, or if they can grab a draft pick or two? Is there value in doing that for them, given they're in that rebuild mode? How do you see things shaking out as the deadline approaches, given all that you said, that it's a little difficult to evaluate when not everyone's playing?
Yeah, I mean, some of the veterans are certainly expiring, and if teams want to come calling, I feel like a Bruce Brown, for example, obviously a useful player. Last time he was like fully healthy, and I guess on a good team, like he was winning a championship with Denver, and who's early in that rotation. So I think the issue with Bruce is that he makes $23 million, so it's not a lot of teams out there that have that much money to sort of like get off. But let's say the Lakers, for example, let's say they want to pivot into a little bit more cap flexibility. They want to get rid of a Rui, for example, or like a Jared Vanderbilt or whatever. It's like you can sort of use that, or Dave Vincent, you can use that as sort of maybe as an experiment to sort of move it around. Bruce has obviously gone through knee surgery, and so he seems to be fine. He seems to be okay. Like, it doesn't seem like physically he's limited. But at the same time, like I think there's some value in his contract. Chris Boucher has been the talk of the week this week. Chris Boucher has been really good. Darko, basically since he's taken over, has not really had a lot of. I don't think Chris has like been his favorite. Let's just say that much, right? Like he just doesn't really see him as like a fit in his system where that he really likes his vibes to be able to play make. And Chris does a lot of great things, but he's not a great playmaker and reader of the game. But at the last week or so, like he's actually been a really, really good player. And I think that, again, there's another expiring salary. That one's a lot smaller. I think he makes like 11 or 12. That's a lot easier for a team to sort of slide in. Like the Clippers, for example, like they got PJ Tucker just sitting around doing nothing. He's not even there. So it's like if you want to flip that and maybe a little bit of an asset, you can send him that way. Certainly the Clippers have signed a lot of former Raptors over the years. There's that type of trade. I think Jakob Poeltl might be kind of interesting because he's actually having a really good year. And, for a team that needs a center, he is pretty, cost controlled. He's making $20 million flat for the next 2 years after this. And I think the Raptors would really need a good deal because they've really kind of paid a lot to get Jakob in the first place. and they don't have a lot of young bigs. They don't have any actually reliable young bigs that can sort of step in and replace him. It's not like someone's ready to ascend, and therefore you can get rid of Jakob. But at the same time, you're rebuilding. So if a team gives you a good offer, and there probably are teams around the league that need size, like Phoenix, for example. I mean, you're putting Yusuf Nurkic on the bench and Mason Plumlee starting for you in the year 2025. Like, you might as well try to make a call for a Jakob if you want to grab a center. You have to entertain those conversations. But I do feel like the Raptors, unlike with Chris and with Bruce, they would probably need a first round pick back for Jakob. Aside from that, I mean, the one thing is the Raptors aren't like most rebuilding teams. Are like, okay, we can take on just like dump salaries on us, no problem. Like we can take whatever. Like basically, if you factor in let's say best case scenario, Raptors win the number 1 overall pick. Number 1 overall pick will start at I think 10.5 billion per year. With the other roster salary commitments the Raptors already have, they would only be about 10, 15 million underneath the luxury tax. So they actually can't take back that much extra money in a trade in return. They could probably take in, again, in that sort of range of 10 to 15. They could probably clear more if they want to get rid of Kelly Olynyk. Again, if a team wants to take Kelly, absolutely go ahead. But yeah, I think they're kind of more minor players, and maybe the biggest move would be if they completely pull the plug on this whole current setup and move their only center in Jakob.
I want to ask about the state of basketball within Canada. Toronto has been a focal point in terms of talent coming out of the country, and particularly, can you speak to that? We've talked to other journalists, experts regarding just the rise of basketball to Canada and how Vince Carter played a big role. Is there anything else that played a contribution into the rise of what we're seeing in terms of a lot more Canadian players really taking over the NBA, even college basketball as well?
Yeah, I think Vince obviously had a huge impact, and I think you look at just now there's kind of a second wave. You look at guys like Jamal Murray, Andrew Wiggins, and kind of that wave, and now you see kind of younger guys like even Zach Edey, Shaden Sharp. There's just so many guys now. We used to only celebrate the 2-3 Canadians that were in the league, and I think one of the things too is just continue for the guys to continue to build through the national program too. I know there's high expectations for Team Canada at the Olympics last summer, and they disappointed, losing in the quarterfinals, but just continue to have funding kind of going to that. And you're seeing more Canadians kind of just go to prep school route now and be able to set up themselves to really give themselves an opportunity, whether it's playing in the NBA and overseas. So yeah, the Canadian infrastructure for basketball, I think is as strong as ever. And I think we're now starting to see couple generations now of impact from what Vince brought to Toronto.
Yeah, it's always funny because obviously Vince is huge, and Vince was a big proponent of brought a big spotlight to Canada, Toronto in particular. But I feel like Steve Nash almost gets lost in this conversation here. He did win 2 MVPs. I just remember growing up, it was on TV every day. It was during the time when you had to sit around and wait for SportsCenter to roll around for the next half hour. But I assure you, Canadian SportsCenter was showing Phoenix Suns highlights all the time with Steve Nash, and I was super enamored, and I think that seeing a Canadian win MVP, that was ridiculous. Before that, we had big Bill Wenningtons, we had Samuel Dalembert. It's that's cool. There was Jamal McGlure. There was a certain pride. Jamal McGlure even made the All-Star game once. But seeing Steve was that was also really, really awesome. And I think we'll probably see a second one with Shea winning it this year as well. I think he's certainly the favorite. He's certainly gunning for it, it feels like. But to what Alex has said too, the underground movement in terms of getting AAU programs here in Canada, that only took place in the last 10, 15 years, and getting the infrastructure in place for these players to actually play at a high level, to go compete with top end talents and go to tournaments in the States. And the States also started sending scouts up here too. That's the other thing, is if you don't scout, these people are never going to get a chance. And once you start getting all these Canadian talent, that's the product that the scouts actually coming up here to try to find the next Steve Nash, or the next, whatever, next Shea nowadays. But they send scouts to Ontario, they send scouts to Quebec. There's even a lot of hoopers coming out of Montreal now. And I think that Canada's always been a country of immigrants anyway. And so, we kind of have talent kind of coming across the world anyway. But you have both the NBA spotlight here, but also the infrastructure starting to build. And It's just gonna kind of stay at this like steady pipeline, and it's just be a normal thing that like 3 or 4 Canadians are gonna be in the draft every year, which is awesome.
Go ahead.
Yeah, wanted to kind of call back to your answer about, that 2019 championship. I mean, in some ways, from what you guys have seen growing up and supporting the Raptors, I mean, was it a little bit of maybe sort of a blessing in disguise for the Grizzlies to move away from Vancouver so that there could be sort of a national spotlight on the Toronto Raptors and how things have built up over the last, from Vince Carter on?
I mean, I think if you ask people in Vancouver, they would say no. But no, I think the fact that I think it would have been cool to still have 2 basketball teams in Canada. I think it wouldn't have lessened the impact of the Raptors winning the championship in 2019. I think it's really unfortunate that things didn't work out for like financial reasons in Vancouver, because like you look at Vancouver, Will mentioned Montreal too. Like we have our own CBL league here, kind of like a minor league here in Canada, and there's teams all across the country, and it kind of does show like what we talked about earlier about this growing popularity of basketball in Canada. Like it is across the country. Like when the Raptors do preseason games or training camps in like Vancouver and Montreal, and if they have games there, like they are sold out and it's very high energy and fans are super excited to even just like go to open practices and stuff. So I guess to your question, like I actually would have loved to still have 2 teams here in Canada. I think it would have been great.
It's also just a crime to basketball that there's not a team in the Pacific Northwest
Yeah.
anymore. Like to lose Seattle and Vancouver is ridiculous. Like at least one of those 2 teams should have stuck around because there's just so many talented hoopers that come out from that area, you know.
No, completely agree. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Alex, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Can you let our audience know where they can find you on social media, where they can catch Hello to Welcome, any other projects you're working on for the rest of this year as well?
Yeah, so you can find Hello and Welcome podcasts wherever you download, subscribe, and if you want to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, we're at Hello Welcome Pod across all the platforms. And yeah, we do a lot of Raptors coverage, do a lot of fun. We're doing a lot of fun interviews and revisiting actually the 30th because it's the 30th anniversary season. We're actually going back and revisiting a lot of moments from that 2019 championship run. And yeah, post-game coverage kind of shows during the week throughout the season. Try to be the most comprehensive Raptors / basketball podcasts in Canada, and hope we're doing a good job.